And without further ado, I'd like to introduce and turn the program over to Dr. Chris Heasley, who is the Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership and one of our DEI faculty liaisons. He's also the chair of the Trans Inclusion Working Group and also a Day of Dialogue presenter. So Dr. Heasley, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stokes. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Samuel Lemon. Dr. Lemon began teaching at Neumann University in 2007 in the Division of Arts and Sciences as an adjunct faculty and has taught graduate level classes in organizational and strategic leadership. Currently, Dr. Lemon serves as the program director for the Masters of Science and Organizational and Strategic Leadership program at Neumann. Dr. Lemon is also a published author of 2 books exploring the African American experience. Go Stand Upon the Rock, 2014, is a fact-based novel that profiles the lives of Dr. Lemon's ancestors who were enslaved on Virginia plantations but escaped to Media, PA during the Civil War. His second book, The Case That Shocked the Country, The Unquiet Deaths of Vida Robert and Alexander Maclay Williams, 2017, details the true account of Alexander Maclay Williams, a 16-year-old African-American boy who was wrongly convicted of murder and became the youngest Pennsylvania resident to be executed. For the past few years, Dr. Lemon has been working with several people, including members of the Williams family, to advocate for the posthumous exonerations of Alexander. Dr. Lemon has turned his research on the Williams case into a 6-episode podcast called Mapping the Color of Injustice, which he created with Dr. Keith Reeves, a political science professor at Swarthmore College. 4 podcast episodes are currently airing, with a new episode posted each month. The series will post its final episode in March 2022. Prior to his work in academia, Dr. Lemon had an extensive career in the fields of social services, communications, and community education. His areas of academic interest include social anthropology, cultural diversity, world affairs, immigration, belief systems, African American history, Native American history, and the pre-Columbian America. His personal interests include music, literature, the arts, film and television, gardening, science, and ethnic cuisines. On January 16th, 2022, Dr. Sam Lemon was inducted into the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Spirit Hall of Fame by the Media Fellowship House and the Media Area NAACP. Dr. Lemon was selected to receive his honor because of his involvement in causes that reflect the spirit of Dr. King and the mission of the 2 sponsoring organizations. Dr. Lemon.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Chris and Dr. Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. And it's just, I'm delighted to be here in this webinar hosted by St. Joe's. I'm a St. Joe's grad, and I got a really tremendous life-changing education at St. Joseph's University. And some of the courses in particular that I took made a lifelong impact on me that I carry with me today. So this is a real treat. I call my presentation A Road Less Traveled, an academic journey. And I've done a lot of lecturing on my family history, on issues of race and culture and society and other topics, but I really have never spoken about my own academic journey. So again, this is a real treat for me. I would say that in terms of my academic journey, there are 3 key elements. And this was something I struggled with early on. Finally, later in life, recognizing that I had an associative learning style, which had conflicted with the traditional linear pedagogy of my elementary and secondary undergraduate educations. In a sense, it was kind of a miseducation, and I think I was not unlike a lot of students who just weren't able to fit in narrowly defined educational categories. There was also an absence of cultural relevance to me as well. In my primary and secondary school experience, 12 years of public education, I had 1 teacher of color. In grad school, working on my master's, there were no teachers of color. And then in working on my doctorate in a program at Penn, I had 2 professors of color. So as you can see, it was a real dearth of a cultural aspect that could have been really extremely helpful to me. And I grew up in Media, which is a suburban town outside of Philadelphia, about 15 miles And when I was coming along, there was still de facto segregation in our town, well up into the 1960s. It was very difficult experience in some ways. There wasn't necessarily the open racial conflict that existed in many places, but it was still stifling and difficult to live under and learn under. For example, in addition to local restaurants, which would not serve patrons of color, the local swim club, which was a private club, was also segregated. Not only could kids like me of color could swim there or allowed to swim there, neither were my Jewish friends or my Asian friends. And so those of us who were excluded from that had to swim elsewhere. And a lot of the kids of color learned how to swim in the local creeks. But generally, the students got along well in this working class town. But the educational system was quite rigid in many ways, culturally and ethnically. Some teachers were openly prejudiced, while others were not. And those who were not were generally not only wonderful people, but really excellent educators. But it's interesting, as I noted about the swim club, that was a huge recreational, pastime for students in my school. And I, read Facebook posts today, but people posting fond memories of how wonderful that was, swimming there. And I posted a couple of messages that, hey, didn't you notice that some of your classmates weren't there? And many of them did not. Here were people that I spent 9 months a year with in classes, but in the 3 months during the summer when they were swimming in the local swim club, they didn't notice that me and others like me, were not present. Chris, could you or Dr. Nicole move on to the slide, next slide, please? So again, I mentioned this earlier. I was just a different kind of learner, which made learning difficult for me. I didn't learn in a linear fashion, as I mentioned before. I learned in an associative fashion. So apples are to oranges, like dogs are to cats. That made sense to me. But this kind of the traditional style of learning and rote memorization and not really comprehending course content, but memorizing that and parroting that back to teachers really was not helpful for me and didn't allow me to really comprehend what it was that they were trying to teach and I was trying to learn. Next slide. So the home is the first school, as often been said, and this was an invaluable educational resource for me. The house you're seeing there, my great ancestors, who were former runaway slaves from Southampton County, Virginia, fled during the Civil War. They traveled separately. My great grandfather walking 300 miles from Southampton County to Media, where he was taken in by local white Quakers and sheltered by them. And his wife, Martha Jane Parham, who lived on a neighboring plantation, who traveled separately. And when they arrived in Media, they got established, they got jobs, they got remarried. They'd had a slave marriage in the South, but that was not legally recognized. And so they bought this house in 1872. And 7 generations of my family lived in that house, including me. That upstairs right window was my bedroom. I slept, right beside that window. And in 1920, my great grandfather bought another house a block further north on the street. So we had this kind of a very close-knit family and kind of a kibbutz sort of experience. And I have a lot of terrific memories, but I learned a great deal. Next slide. I want to circle back a bit to my elementary school experience. And as I said, I had 1 or 2 teachers who were just absolutely wonderful. And I was a rather withdrawn student. I'd had a very difficult and impoverished childhood, and I had a speech impediment at one point. And they were wonderful teachers because they knew how much to leave me alone when they could see I needed space, how to engage me. They were incredibly respectful and wonderful educators, and I learned a great deal from them. But as I mentioned earlier, there was this underlying prejudice, racial and ethnic prejudice that ran through the schools. And so in fifth grade, we had a weekly music class. And we would go to this class each week and we would sing these songs and a lot of Americana stuff. And one of the music teacher's favorite songs was Dixie. And I'm sure oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton. And so here you have a classroom that is 50% students of color and 50% white students. And of all the songs we would sing, she would never get a very robust response from us. And she would make us sing it over and over again. And you could see the wheels turning in her mind. And she could, counting visually how many students there were and thinking, they should be singing the song louder, never taking in consideration for a moment that students like me had descendants who had ancestors who were runaway slaves. And there was no way in heck that I wished I was in Dixie or that I would live and die for Dixie. And, that I found was really cruel. And I couldn't quite understand why this otherwise seemingly nice white music teacher would force us to sing this song. And it's not unlike the national anthem. If you read the third verse of the national anthem, you'll never want to sing that song again, because it talks about the slave and the hireling being fearful for their lives and until they find the grave. I mean, these cultural pillars of American society are really quite cruel when you dig down into them. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the home was the first school. And what I did to supplement my own education was read about things that really fascinated me. And many of those were historical biographies and famous leaders and famous events. I read widely in Native American culture and history, and that spurred me to develop a system of learning on my own, even though I really wasn't getting much of that in the classroom. And so there's a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain. I have that in a question mark because it's not definitive that he actually said it, but don't let your schooling get in the way of your education. And that's exactly what I did without knowing it. I began kind of self-educating because I wasn't getting what I needed inside the classroom. So, in a sense, the world became my classroom. The library became my classroom. And I just was an avid reader. Next slide. Okay. One of the things, and actually, Chris, could we go back to that slide, the previous slide? Yeah, thank you. So I want to speak just a little bit more about my high school experience. When I was in junior high school and my working class school, which had originally been K to 12, our districts merged with the surrounding district, which was uh, predominantly white and a bit more influential, not influential, but socioeconomically, folks were on a bit of a higher level. And so the districts merged, and immediately what the school system did was begin categorizing people. And so, they began separating us who had been classmates, all through school from our elementary years, into AP and general education, and even within the AP, there were tiers. So there was the top were the quote unquote smart students, and they were taking Latin and calculus, and then there were students like me who didn't get as much academic support, and we drifted. And the problem, key problem with that categorization of students was, I could no longer go over to my friend's house to study. And I might have a friend who was good with math. He could help me out with that. Maybe I could help another friend with something else. But we lost that resource of lateral learning, much like what occurs in families with siblings, and that was very destructive for students like me. And what that forced us to do was to ask questions in class, which I certainly would not do because I didn't want to appear stupid, and I was ashamed to ask questions. And that was really misguided, administration on the school's part. And not only did that affect us, academically, it impacted us socially because Now, obviously, junior high school are very, very difficult times for adolescents, and taking away supports, whether that be academic supports or social supports or community supports was really a bad decision. It was bad education. But kind of interestingly, the kids who had been sort of categorized into, they're never going to go to college and were given general ed classes, they tend to get involved in programs like Autobody. And interestingly enough, shortly after they graduated, these were the kids who had houses down the shore and boats. Where students like me who were struggling in college or dropped out of college, we weren't faring so well. But I did have invaluable support and encouragement of a few key members of the educational system, who saw something in me at a time when I could not see it myself. So consequently, coming out of that system, and I think much of this is true today with the differences between often urban-based schools or rural-based schools, and those schools and districts which are more affluential and have the ability to pump money into the school system. So again, I was poorly prepared by the time I came to St. Joe's as a freshman. And as I said before, there was only kind of one traditional learning style. But today we know that there are maybe 11 or 12 different learning styles that are recognized in educational psychology. So again, that ROTE learning style really did not work for me, and it gave me the impression that I wasn't that smart. And so I dropped out of St. Joe's in my third year. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And eventually came back and then finished up. But when I applied to grad school at Westchester University, the School of Education, I had an option of which standardized test I could take. And I always did miserably, as many students do, on the culturally biased standardized test. So I took the Miller Analogies test. And I aced that test. I shocked myself. And the reason why is because that was the way that I thought. I had a more analytical, a way of comparing things. And that test made so much sense to me. And that was the beginning of a change in how I thought about myself as a student. So when I arrived at St. Joe's as kind of a long-haired hippie kid, I did well in a few courses like English writing because I wrote poetry. I wrote short stories, but I struggled miserably in the sciences and math and philosophy. I had never read a book of philosophy before I arrived at St. Joe's. And so my repeated failures, my early years at the university, led me to drop out, as I said, in my senior year. And it just my failures compounded my learning challenges and mistakenly confirmed to me that I simply was not that smart. One of the people that played a incredibly huge role for me at St. Joe's was the late Father Francis F. Birch, S.J. He was not only my English teacher, but he became a mentor for me. He was a brilliant man. He earned his doctorate in French at the Sorbonne in Paris, and I would not have graduated without his help. And shortly before I dropped out of school, he pulled my academic records, and he was not pleased at all. He could see I was a miserable student, affable but miserable. And he gave me a very stern lecture at that point. And I was disappointed because I thought this guy was my friend, and but quickly afterwards, I determined that he really was my friend because he gave me a good dose of reality and helped me focus on myself and my goals and my career. And after I returned to St. Joe's, and I was a completely different student. I was an A student actually after that, and it was because I had changed. Being out in the work world for a year or two, I quickly saw that you can't get anywhere in life, or it's very difficult to, without at least a bachelor's degree. And the first couple of courses I took were comparative religions, which was one of the best courses I've ever taken in my life, because it just expand my thinking and my horizons immeasurably. And coming out of my family had traditionally been members of the local Episcopal Church, and like many formal religions, they tend to imply, if not openly, covertly, that that is the right way, and other people are kind of more or less wrong, or wasting their time. And when I learned, about the principles of Buddhism and Islam, and Taoism, and other religions, like it was like a light bulb went off in my head. I mean, it was just incredibly enlightening. And I was required to take two more theology courses, and I took 2 courses in Judaism taught by a rabbi on St. Joe's campus. And they were the 3 best courses I had taken in my entire undergraduate experience. So I'm greatly indebted to St. Joe's for providing those types of instructors who really spurred me on to on the road to being a scholar. Okay, so again, just to close out on the failures of the traditional academic system, as a program director, I run a master's program in business and organizational leadership at Neumann University, and I constructed that program. Well, I was the 3rd director, but I've crafted that program and adopted that program in a way that kind of modeled my doctoral program at Penn. So I require that same level of academic rigor for the master's students in the program. And as I said, it's a 10-course progressive curriculum, and when students complete the final course, and they rate with we call our master's thesis a capstone research project. They do really quite well, but I eliminate from that the traditional types of learning methodologies, because they have served me so poorly. And it has made our students succeed, and the program really quite successful. Past 5 years running, my program's received either state or national recognition, and our completion rate is actually higher than St. Joe's similar leadership program. So really, I'm quite proud of that. But a lot of damage is done by educators, both past and present, to the children who learn differently. And they're not just educational gatekeepers; they're cultural gatekeepers as well. And you can see what's happening in the country today. This angry pushback about learning history properly, and the truth about properly. And probably the low points in recent history with academic pedagogy and planning, the No Child Left Behind law, which was disastrous, because all it really did was it taught students it forced teachers to teach to the test. And so they would spend an inordinate amount of time. And I worked for a school district for 6 years, and they were quite unhappy, because it made them take time away from the typical subjects that they were teaching to focus singularly on the standardized test. And again, it really robbed students of a richer academic experience that they could have they could have benefited greatly from. And if you look at who the Secretary of Education was, Nancy DeVos, who had a bachelor's of business administration, not a single education course under her belt, no ever experience teaching or any other academic qualifications. That was really damaging. And so it's essential that we have good people in education, both on the level of professors and teachers and instructors, but administrators as well, because education has an indelible, lifelong impact on students, and that can be either positive or negative. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned, the home is the first school. This is my great-grandfather, William H. Ridley. I'm living in his house today that he bought in 1920. He was the first person of color admitted to the Delaware County Bar in 1891. Just to give you a sense of span of time. By 1960, there have only been 3 attorneys of color admitted to the Delaware County Bar, and that third attorney, 10 years later in 1970, was appointed to be our first Black judge by then Governor Milton Schaap. So, between 1891 and 1970, when we had our first, from the first Black attorney to the first Black judge, that's a heck of a span of time. And, we often think of the North as being progressive and opportunities for people of color, but that often really is not the case. So next slide, please. So again, I keep mentioning that the home is the first school, and what I learned in terms of what my grandmother taught me, and I lived with her in this very house. That she owned the house after my great grandfather, her father, passed away, and we spent countless hours together, especially on the weekends when I wasn't in school, talking about the family history. And we were really quite fortunate to have lots of old archival photographs. And I just absorbed this knowledge like a sponge. I love learning about these people. I love these people who died long before I was even born. And I wanted to know, like, how did they think, and what did they do, and what happened to them, and how did they navigate the challenges in life. And on the far right, there is my great grandfather, Cornelius Ridley. And as I mentioned, he was enslaved by his owner, who was also his father. He said he never knew his mother. Cornelius had red hair, green eyes, and very fair skin. So when he decided to escape, he walked 300 miles from Southampton County plantation to Media. He said no one ever stopped him because everyone he met assumed he was a white man, and he didn't say any differently. And it kind of fit into the development of the title of my dissertation, which was the construction of ethnoracial identity within situational contexts. So, how people perceive you says a lot about your identity. How you perceive yourself, how you define yourself, is the other side of that coin. But interestingly enough, his life on the plantation, he said he was generally treated pretty well. And I think that's in large part because he looked like one of the family members. His job, quote unquote, on the plantation was that of being a carriage driver. And on a scale of, jobs, that was probably the best job you could have on a plantation because it allowed you a good amount of freedom traveling around by yourself. But even more importantly, it gave you the geographical knowledge that virtually no other slaves had. Because in addition to divesting slaves of their language and their culture and their history and memory, one way of enforcing, their oppression, along with violence and murder, was keeping them geographically ignorant. The average slave never traveled more than 5 miles from home, so it was difficult for them to escape, even if they really wanted to. And so, Cornelius had this vast geographical knowledge that I think was directly a factor in helping him to succeed in his escape. The picture to the left of him is my great-great-grandmother, Cornelius's wife, Martha Jane Parham. I'm not exactly sure how old she is in that picture. She's wearing slave garb, so I assume that was taken while she was still enslaved. She could be anywhere, I think, between 14 and 24. She had a dramatically different experience. Her plantation owner, at the age of 14, she was forced to become a breeding woman. And slave breeding was a cottage industry in the Upper South, because the owners and overseers willingly help in that process. It's one of the reasons why the slave populations in the U.S., particularly in the northern U.S., were exponentially larger than slave populations elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. So when she arrived in Media and told my grandmother, her only granddaughter, about her experience, she would really never talk about the South because she was obviously quite traumatized about this 10 years of institutional rape she had to endure. And that's a part of slavery many people aren't aware of. From watching Roots and other 12 Years a Slave, they know about the slave beatings and the horrible treatment and the malnourishment, but they don't often hear about this plight the slave women often had to endure, beginning on the Middle Passage, on the voyage on ships after being kidnapped from Africa. So yeah, these are people who hold high esteem in my life, have been incredible role models, and this is why I wanted to base my dissertation and my first novel, my first book, on them. Next slide. Okay, I'll get this in just a moment. I deliberately made a conscious decision that I wanted to earn a doctorate first. I wanted to write a dissertation first before writing a book about the lives of my ancestors, because I wanted it to rest on solid research. Because one of the problems with writing a novel, sometimes people take literary license, but other times people may face skepticism from others saying, well, yeah, it couldn't really have happened like that. So, I spent, as I said, a great deal of time, even before I knew I was learning and becoming a budding researcher, after talking with my grandmother, researching the names of the places that she gave me and tracking them down. And I was actually able to visit the two plantations that my great-great-grandparents came from. That was an overwhelmingly powerful experience. Nobody in my family had ever been back there since my ancestors had escaped during the Civil War. So, I again wanted to have this dissertation based on solid historical and genealogical research, and then, from there, write my first book. So I'm just going to read to you briefly the synopsis from the abstract for the construction of ethnoracial identity within situational contexts. You can read more about this on Penn's Scholarly Commons website, but it was based largely on data collected from oral history interviews. This study examines the construction of triracial ethnoracial identities, African American, Caucasian American Indian, here in-depth narratives and analysis of two triracial family histories surface the complex dynamic and interracial social social contingencies that act on individual and family psychologies to share ethnic identity. These processes are illustrative of the anthropological construct of situationality. So again, I mean, what my ancestors went through, and we know from scientific research, not just on slavery, but people who were victims of famine and war, that impact, that biological, physiological impact, psychological impact, is passed down through the generations. And scientists have found elements of trauma in those descendants who never experienced those original traumatic situations. So it's something that we feel even as descendants today. So this was I completed the dissertation and then began working on the novel Go Stand Upon the Rock, and I was meticulous in my primary research, because I knew that obviously there were no video cameras or electronic recording back in the 1800s. So I didn't know exactly what happened. I had this oral history, but I wanted that to rest on solid historical research, academic research. So every aspect of my novel, I just chased down solid research on that. So the culture, the customs, the events, transportation, banking, geography, geology, meteorology, weather, crops, and military campaigns, all of that rests on solid historical research. And I wanted it to my book to be nearly indisputable, because it wasn't just a novel, yes, but a fact-based historically based novel. And one of the books that I found that really inspired me was a woman named Susie King Taylor, her biography, Reminiscences of My Life in Camp. She was a Black woman who had been enslaved, at some point escaped, and she became a nurse for the 33rd USCT, United States Colored Troops. And when I wrote about her life story, it was startling to me how closely it was to my own ancestors' story. My ancestor Martha Jane Parham, she and two of her children, a 2-year-old and a 9-year-old, along with her brother and his 2-year-old, escaped from their plantation, and they were close to Petersburg. And as the Union Army was marching by to the siege of Petersburg, they made it to the Army lines. And at that point, the Army would not return you to the South, which they did earlier in the war. But General Benjamin Butler said, "Why are we doing this? They're using these enslaved people to build military fortifications, carry weapons and supplies. We're not going to do that." So my ancestors spent time there at the siege of Petersburg, among the 6 United States Colored Troops. So again, her experience mirrored that very much as Susie King Taylor's. Just a final word about enslavement in America. Some of the numbers have been much inflated over the years, but according to Henry Louis Gates at Harvard, he said in 1860 there were nearly 4 million people enslaved, and the majority of them were in the South. There were some in the North as well, but of that number, less than 1%, maybe only 20,000, which would be 0.5%, as successfully escaped slavery. And they were many, largely young, healthy men who were able to do that. So, so for a young woman like my ancestor to escape not only with herself, but 2 children with her was just a remarkable achievement. So, I'm a descendant of this 1%, which really lit a fire in me, inspired me to remember them and their sacrifices, because without them, I would not be here where I am today. They're buried in Eden Cemetery, which is the oldest Black cemetery in the country, very close to William Still, who was referred to as the father of the Underground Railroad. So I strongly encourage everyone, but particularly students of color, to record your family history, preserve that history, because you're not going to find that largely in books unless you put it in a book. And that provides a rich cultural and historical and ethnic experience and foundation for us to build on. So I would say in closing that I think about the words of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu in terms of racism and oppression. And again, I have a problem with that, and I'm not shy about speaking out with that and trying to be an advocate for justice and in particular and equality. But he said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So we it's not enough for us to be not racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to be activists, for equality and particularly justice. And if you see what's going on in the country today, we need all the help that we can get. So there's so much in the world in our country I cannot do anything about. Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, countless, Sandra Bland, countless cases of injustice. But I found one I could do something about. And so you're looking at the slide of Alexander Maclay Williams and the district attorney at that time who was next to him. Alexander Maclay Williams is the youngest known person executed in the state of Pennsylvania. He was a 16-year-old Black student. They were called inmates at that time in 1930 because Glen Mills was run like a prison for boys. And he was falsely accused, convicted, forced into false confession, and then sentenced to death. And he was sent to the electric chair here in Pennsylvania in 1931, never really knowing why. And so when I was a kid, about 10 or 12 years old, my grandmother told me about this story. She had one little tiny newspaper clipping about it. And so there was something about it that I could not forget. I mean, it's a horrible story in many ways. But as I grew older, I began to do primary research. And I reached out to Glen Mills School. The superintendent at that time gave me permission to review Alexander's school records, which are down at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. That's where all their archives were. I collected almost every article I could find. This case made national headlines in 1930. Texas, California, and British Columbia on the Pacific coast. This was a huge case because it had been picked up by the Associated Press, and headlines flashed all across the country. This was essentially a case of deadly, lethal domestic violence, repackaged as a race sex crime murder. And I spent some 35 years researching this case, which resulted in my book. I think that book might be on the next slide. Can we move to the next slide? No, not yet. But this is, as you can see on the left, a list of just some of the newspapers across the country that were covering the story. And you can see the David versus Goliath imbalance. There was William Ridley, my great-grandfather, who was, again, the only attorney of color at the time, being appointed to represent this black 16-year-old, and then the entire weight of the prosecutorial team and the institution of criminal justice here in Delaware County against him. He was given, in fact, he wasn't even appointed by the court to represent Alexander until about 2.5 weeks after Alexander had made his third undocumented confession, and without a parent or a guardian present, which would not happen today. There was no Miranda warning at the time, but there was the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, and other aspects, the Fourth and Sixth and 14th Amendment in terms of due process, none of which Alexander got. So this was a case that was decided before my great-grandfather even was brought on board. There was a huge uproar in the community. People wanted to see this this violent child. The press kept trying to promote Alexander, present Alexander as a young man. He was only 16 years old. There was no direct evidence tying him to the case other than these coerced confessions. And there was a lot of evidence that was suppressed or unknown at the time. Next slide, please. This is just one or two things I want to show you. In researching, this is a copy of the victim, Vida Robert's death certificate. And you can see that virtually all of it is written in black ink. That's the signature of the coroner who signed that, George H. Wrigley. And then at some point, somebody in a different handwriting using blue ink altered that document and wrote in there, puncture wounds to the heart caused by ice pick in the hands of Alexander McClay Williams. So I've seen maybe hundreds of death certificates. I've only seen one or two that listed an assailant's name. But what's unique about this one is if you look at the bottom far left corner, October 4th, 1930, that's when the registrar recorded this death certificate. But Alexander didn't make his first confession until 3 days later on October 7th. So who could possibly know, unless they had, ESB, that this kid was going to confess to a murder three days after this death certificate was signed. Next slide. This is another document that was altered by someone. So this is a copy of Alexander's death certificate after he was electrocuted on June 6, 1931. And so you can see all the demographic information there. But you can see in the top there, I've enlarged two boxes, 6 and 7. So it lists his date as July 23rd, 1914, which is his correct date. In block number 7, you can see the number under the years had been 16, but somebody kind of clumsily drew a loop on the top of the 6. You can see it's even different, a different level of depthness of black ink to show that he was, 18 instead of 16. But what this forger forgot to do was change the birth year, because had Alexander been 18, his birth year would have been 1912, not 1914. So this just shows the extent of the corruption of the police, detectives, prosecutor, and even the judge who heard the case. When Ridley, my great grandfather, brought out in court that the so-called confession had been illegally obtained by deceiving a magistrate, who had ordered that Alexander remain in prison except to attend a further hearing. The detectives took him out of prison without telling the magistrate why, and so they illegally obtained this confession, which I'm sure was certainly beaten out of him. And that earlier picture of him, the district attorney, who's waving the ice pick that they forced Alexander to touch. The judge said, so what if that be the case? So what? What does that have to do with it? Well, obtaining, a false confession, especially illegally, should have been immediately tossed as evidence, but it was not. So I was able to track down actually a niece of the victim, Vida Robert, who lives in Michigan, and she told me, she said, I can't speak for my whole family, but a lot of us never thought Alexander did that crime. We always thought it was my Uncle Fred. And partly because he had a long history of violence. About 1925, the couple had been married in Schoolcraft County, Michigan. But about 1925 or 1926, Vida sued for divorce and was awarded a divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty. So I think it's almost certain that her husband murdered her in a fit of rage. She was stabbed 47 times with an ice pick, as you can see. That's a crime of passion. That's a crime in which you're intimately knowledgeable of the victim. So that was really valuable to me, which we were able to share that information with the attorney who was representing Alexander's case for us. Next slide. This is referencing in 2017, my colleague Robert Keller, who is Alexander's attorney, went to court to seek a partial expungement of Alexander's records, conviction. Expungement really only just takes the information off the books. It doesn't address guilt or innocence, but he was struggling to find some way that he could do something for the family. I insisted that it be a partial expungement because the most valuable information still extant in this case is a 300-page court trial transcript, 1930 and 31, which I read. It took me about two Friday afternoons to read the entire thing. When I read it, it was heartbreaking because these people made no attempts to hide what they were doing to this poor kid, who was essentially beaten into confessing to a crime he did not commit. And it's very much like the case of George Stinney Jr., who in 1944 in South Carolina was electrocuted for double murder he did not commit. He could not have possibly committed. He remains probably the youngest person executed in the 20th century. So his amicus brief I read as well, and based my research and my recommendations, legal analysis of this case to Mr. Keller, who shared it with our local district attorney. Next slide. Pretty much close to being done here. Yes, there is Robert Keller and myself and Alexander's sole surviving sibling. She will be 92 this month, and Alexander had been buried without a headstone, and the family got together and did a GoFundMe page, and bought this headstone for him. We've had a great deal of press regarding this case. The first one was the one by Mary Schaefer above on June 2014, 2015. That was a full page article on page 2 of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Much more recently, we got a great article by Alabrano, also the Philadelphia Inquirer, in 2018. We currently are running, as Dr. Chris mentioned earlier, a podcast. All 6 episodes of the podcast have been posted just in the past few days. So I encourage you to go listen to that. It's incredibly dynamic, and it has voices of everyone immediately involved in this case. And I thank Mary Schaefer for actually finding that trial transcript, because for decades, the county offices had told me, oh, that's all destroyed, that's all gone. Mary Schaefer filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and they were forced to produce this document. And so without her and doing that, we would have never had the ammunition and facts to bolster our case. Next slide. Okay, so I would just like to say in closing, please, pick up my books if you would. The Case That Shocked the Country. It's available on Amazon, and also Go Stand Upon the Rock, which is the first of my planned trilogy about my family's, history and culture. And please listen to this podcast if you will. I certainly encourage all students, but particularly students of color, go into careers where you can make a difference. Education being number one. You can become not just professors, but university administrators. The program I run, I supervise a dozen adjuncts. So, I can make an impact on one class at a time, but when I'm, supervising 12 adjuncts, that, exponentially multiplies the impact that I can have on the program, on the students. Our country is in desperate measures right now, and many with good reason feel like we're on the verge of a second civil war. So I encourage you, number one, complete your educations, vote, register to vote, motivate everyone you can to do that. Pursue careers in local government, school boards, courts, criminal justice, and because we're facing a time of book banning and voter suppression. So, we have to tell our own stories and be our own advocates. So thank you for listening. I know that was quite a mouthful. I'm happy to entertain questions for you.
Thank you, Dr. Lemon. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I invite our audience to put questions, if you have them, in the Q&A feature at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a couple of questions for you. First relates to the connection between the two cases, with your ancestor and his representation of Alexander. Can you talk more about the process of, as you said, taking ownership of your own education and beginning the process of documenting your family history and the oral history, the great tradition of oral history that exists in the Black community? For others who might want to go down a similar journey in their own families, where would they start?
By talking to the oldest people in your family. That would be number one. And if you record that, that would be wonderful. I have an interview I did with my grandmother probably about 1978, and it's just amazing to hear her voice. But oral history is remarkably accurate. People often think, well, things get lost, but typically family stories, everybody knows them. So if you're around the dinner table on Sunday or Thanksgiving and somebody's telling the story, if somebody verges off from the traditional story, they are quickly corrected. No, that's not how it happened. It happened like this. So it's a great way of preserving, that history. Before the printed word, there was only the spoken word, and that's how we had griots, which were popular in Africa. People who would memorize, large amounts of community and local history and family histories. So I would say, yeah, start there. I would also say start with documentation in terms of if you don't have birth certificates, death certificates, track those down. You can find a lot of stuff online through ancestry.com. Death certificates are invaluable because that'll tell you parents' names and children's names and those types of things. I'm a member of Ancestry, and I've gotten invaluable information on that website. So I would say, those would be good spots. There are also historical websites for newspaper articles in which you can type a person's name in and do a search. And I found articles. I forget the name of the website, if it's articles.com or something, but articles about my ancestors that I never knew about. About Cornelius, my great-great-grandfather, getting hit by a car, at the turn of the 1900s. I never knew that. So it's just critical that we preserve this information. And the National Archives had the collection of slave narratives, and people often in their own voices telling their stories. Look at some of them. I mean, they're heartbreaking in one way, but they're invaluable in another way. And you can. There are also websites now. Slavevoyages.com, I think, is the name of it, where you can track down sailing ships, and you can do this on Ancestry to some extent. But I found Cornelius' sister had been sold away when he was a young boy to someone in New Orleans, and he never saw or heard from her again. And so I was able to find in the inbound shipping manifest for the port of New Orleans, I think I found her, and her name and a description of her, and who the seller was. He was an infamous slave seller in Richmond. But that hurt me. I've traveled, I've carried that hole in my heart all my life. So I'm bound and determined someday to find out what happened to my Aunt Rosa. But I would say start there, please.
Wow, thank you. Oh my goodness. As we think about and reflect on Black History Month and a lot of these kinds of stories that may exist in our own families, one of the things that you said very early on in your presentation was, the acknowledgement of your mentors, those in your educational journey that saw something in you that you perhaps didn't see in yourself. And this is something I connect to and think about a lot as an educator. The fact that we have the power oftentimes to make or break a young person's educational experience. Can you talk more about the mentoring and the role that educators in your journey that helped you to get the skills to be able to document your family history the way you have?
I would say really the documentation of my family history, I kind of learned that on my own without knowing it. And again, it started with living with my grandma when I was a kid, and I don't know how I memorized all this stuff, but by the time I was 12 years old, I was the family historian because I just, soaked that stuff up like a sponge. What was really helpful to me in particular was my doctoral program at Penn, because I'd already come with a set of research skills, which I didn't know I had accumulated through genealogy research. But Penn really taught me to be a good researcher. And examine that primary evidence, that primary research, collect that meticulously, be really careful in terms of how I collect that information, organize it, and I am in a great debt to the University of Pennsylvania Grad School of Education, my doctoral program. My doctorate area of specialization was education, culture, and society. And again, much like my education at St. Joe's, the education I got at Penn was remarkable. And much like Father Bircho I mentioned, gave me quite a stern talking to when I needed it. My dissertation chair at Penn, I don't know how this guy had time to sleep at night, because he read every comma, and I was not his only student. My dissertation was like 300 pages. And he read like every comma, and he just kept pushing me and holding me to this really high bar, and I would send him these chapters which I just thought were brilliant, and he would send them back and was like all marked up, like the principal had just redlined them. And he pushed me to go beyond what I thought were my limits, and that was invaluable. And so at graduation, he said to me, that was one of the best dissertations I ever read. I said, well, that's because of you, because you pushed me to go, beyond, again, what I thought were my limits. And we always think that we're limited in some ways, but we can unlock like an ingenuity and endurance, that we don't know that we have. So, push ourselves, compete with ourselves, not with other people, and we're capable of achieving great things.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. One of the last questions that I would like to ask you is more of a personal one. How would you how would you advise our students who are struggling with, I'm so happy that you mentioned learning styles. And oftentimes one of the things we tend to do is to teach as teachers in ways that complement the ways in which we learn. So what advice would you give to our students who may be in a similar situation as you, finding that there is a mismatch of teaching style to their particular learning style, and what are some strategies that could help them to either find their way in terms of the education or advocate for the needs that they have in the classroom?
Great question. I would say, number one, don't think that there's something wrong with you, that the problem is you. The problem might be the institution or the pedagogy, that's been traditional. American pedagogy has always been rote learning. Memorize this stuff. Don't learn it. Memorize it and parrot it back. That helps no one. So I would say, don't get down on yourself because you're struggling with something, because a teacher or an instructor might be brilliant, but if they can't convey that course content in a way that you can understand, then they're part of the problem. So I would say, don't assume that you're part of the problem. You just have a different way of learning. Academic counseling would be a great thing to pursue. There wasn't such a thing, back in my day. But I would say, yeah, you might even want to consider, scholastic testing in terms of trying to figure out what are the best ways for you to learn. Learn as much as you can on your own. Most of what I've learned in life, I've learned on my own. The world is your classroom. And so read about things that you like. I mean, we all have to take courses that we don't like. And the only thing I remember about philosophy at St. Joe's was Kierkegaard's Leap of Faith, which sometimes you got to take, but but learn on your own as much as you can, because as I said, I found out, like, when I was doing all this research and writing and genealogy stuff, I was developing skills I didn't know that I had, until I got to the grad school and Penn. So we can teach ourselves a heck of a lot, but don't lose faith in yourself. Believe in yourself, even if it seems like no one else does, because you got something going. So hang in there.
Thank you. And I will ask you for one last comment. We talked about this a little bit when we were practicing for this session, this concept of when one falls down, right? And kind of what do they need, or what is inside them that propels them to get up when they are faced with a challenge. And one of the things that spoke to me about your story is, coming back after a period of dropping out, finishing your education, and then acquiring so much more education on your journey. Can you talk a little bit about that resilience and what helped you to pick yourself back up?
Absolutely. Yeah. A couple of things. I often think about this, that quote in boxing, in terms of, how hard a hit can you give, but how hard a hit can you take? And if you get knocked down, to pick yourself up, dust yourself up, and get back, on that saddle. I think about my ancestors and all that they went through. I deeply love them, and particularly my great grandmother, all that she endured. And I think sometimes I have problems, like, look what they achieved, look what they overcame in their life, and they're an active part of my life. I mean, I have the pictures on my wall. I talk to them every night. I tell them I love them, because I believe those spiritual connections do not end, do not die. We are products of our environment, but also those people are living within us in terms of our DNA and our genetics and the skills and the abilities that we have. So I would say, yeah, I mean, but believe in yourself. Look to those in your families, who achieve things, like my great grandfather, the first attorney of color, and I want him to be proud of me. So I want to live my life in a way in which they would be proud of me. So look to those heroes and find those heroes. They may not even necessarily be biological relatives, but you have relatives. You have people who care about you. Find them and help them to nurture and guide you.
What a wonderful way to end tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Lemon. Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. This was a fantastic presentation, and I'm really just inspired by everything that you have shared with us in terms of us learning who we are as a people, learning our personal narrative, personal story. And as you said, how many hits can one take, right? All the ways that we can pick ourselves up and really keep going. So thank you so much for sharing your family with us. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And this is an amazing program. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. It's been an honor participating in this. It's great to come back home to St. Joe's. And if I could, I just would like to
Please
to hold up my book there, Go Stand Upon the Rock. And again, that's available on Amazon as well. But if you read that, it'll tell you who I am, and it'll show you how I rediscovered myself. And education is a way of helping us evolve, and evolution should never stop. So you got some bright minds out there. Use them, to help make the world a better place.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you to Dr. Lemon. We appreciate your time. Thank you for your expertise. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.